Racist cop attack, black woman, but her secret power shocks him. In this gripping video, we delve into a shocking incident that unfolds when a prejudiced police officer targets a black woman. What starts as a distressing confrontation quickly turns into an unexpected revelation that leaves everyone astounded. This powerful narrative explores themes of prejudice, resilience, and the surprising strength that often lies hidden within us. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.
Tasha Owens moved silently through the shadows of the old, abandoned warehouse, her footsteps muffled against the dust-covered concrete floor. The dim glow from the streetlights outside barely seeped through the grimy windows, casting eerie patterns on the cracked walls and rusted machinery. It was a place forgotten by time and people, the perfect location for Tasha's late-night training sessions, where she could immerse herself in the solace of solitude. Here she could stretch every muscle, focus her mind, and channel the inner discipline that had kept her resilient through years of demanding work. To an outsider, Tasha was just a regular woman in her 30s, dressed in a simple black hoodie and athletic pants. But those who knew her background would understand that her unassuming appearance masked an extraordinary skill set. She wasn't just a martial artist, she was a former intelligence operative, with years of experience in handling high-stakes situations, mastering the art of self-defense, and reading people with unnerving precision. Now, away from her former life, she lived quietly, anonymously, yet she was never without the vigilance instilled in her from years of training. Each muscle memory, each reflex, every instinct was sharpened and ready, even in these quieter moments. Tonight, she felt a familiar tingling at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She stood perfectly still, allowing the feeling to settle in her consciousness. Years of fieldwork had taught her that ignoring intuition was a mistake. It was the quietest cues, the smallest signals, that often meant the difference between safety and peril. She was aware of every sound in the building, the drip of water somewhere in the distance, the hum of a nearby generator. Her mind catalogued these noises, storing them as part of the background, while she focused on the one thing that felt out of place, the faint shuffle of steps, too deliberate to belong to some random passerby. Outside, Officer Kyle Stevens sat idly in his squad car, eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Tasha's shadowy figure moving within the warehouse. He had been patrolling this part of town, as he did every night, drawn to areas that seemed problematic, or, at least, problematic in his eyes. It was an unspoken truth among his peers that Stevens had a certain way of handling things, a roughness that sometimes bordered on intimidation. He justified it as keeping the peace or showing them who's boss. But in reality, it was more about his own frustrations and insecurities, his need to feel dominant, his resentment towards those who didn't fit his mold of what was right. He couldn't quite place what it was about this woman, this silhouette moving through the warehouse, that irritated him. Maybe it was her calmness, the way she seemed so assured, as though she belonged here in a place that, to him, represented the underbelly of the city, the abandoned, the unwanted. Or maybe it was the fact that she was alone and seemingly unafraid. The usual suspects he encountered during his shifts, the loiterers, the teenagers up to no good, the homeless drifting through the alleys they usually averted their eyes, made themselves smaller, submissive. But this woman, even from a distance, projected something different, something challenging. Stevens hadn't intended to stop at the warehouse tonight. He had been on a straightforward route through his patrol area, just passing through. But something about the way she moved, her complete disregard for any potential threat, gnawed at him. He wasn't used to people, especially women, projecting such confidence in his presence. His annoyance grew as he watched her, a flicker of frustration that quickly turned into a burning need to assert his authority, to remind her, and perhaps himself of who held the power here. With a heavy sigh, Stevens pushed open his car door, the loud creak echoing through the quiet night as he stepped out. He straightened his uniform, taking a moment to adjust the cuffs of his jacket, a small ritual that helped him feel in control. The cool night air hit his face as he strode toward the warehouse, his footsteps deliberate, each one punctuated by the click of his heels against the pavement. He walked slowly, with the air of someone who expected compliance, of someone who had no doubt that his word would be the final one. As he approached, he could see Tasha's form more clearly now, tall, poised, a woman whose movements suggested strength and precision rather than the meekness he anticipated. Tasha heard him before she saw him. She didn't need to turn around to recognize the purposeful cadence of his footsteps, the subtle weight of authority mixed with arrogance in each step. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, instinctively shifting her weight in a subtle stance that allowed her to react quickly if needed. As he neared, she could sense the energy emanating from him, the silent command, the presumption of superiority, as though he expected her to cower at his approach. But Tasha wasn't the type to cower. She hadn't been for a long time. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced tone of an officer who had made this speech countless times, yet still laced with an undercurrent of hostility. "Mind telling me what you're doing here this late?" He made no effort to hide his skepticism, his distrust. To him, her presence here was inherently suspect, an oddity that needed correction. Tasha turned slowly, meeting his gaze with calm, steady eyes that betrayed no hint of fear. "Just training," she replied simply, her voice even, giving away nothing. Her directness caught him off guard for a second, but he quickly regained his composure, stepping a bit closer, the faint smell of stale coffee and cigarettes lingering in the air around him. "Training," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "In an abandoned warehouse." At this hour he chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. "Seems like a strange place to be. Unless, of course, you're up to something else." His eyes narrowed, scanning her from head to toe, searching for any sign of weakness, any indication that he was getting under her skin. But Tasha remained unflinching, her expression impassive. "Look, officer, I'm just here to work out. It's quiet, and I like the space," she replied, keeping her tone level. Her calmness seemed to agitate him even more. He wasn't used to this, someone looking him directly in the eye, not backing down, not scrambling to explain themselves. Most people by now would be nervously offering apologies, fumbling for an excuse to avoid further confrontation. Stevens took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes glinting with a mixture of annoyance and intrigue. "And you just expect me to believe that?" He shook his head, an almost mocking smile creeping onto his face. "Women like you don't usually hang around places like this. You should be careful. Things happen in spots like these, especially to those who don't belong." Tasha's expression didn't change, but inside she could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that always accompanied confrontation. She knew his type, men who hid their insecurities behind a badge, who used authority as a weapon to compensate for their own perceived inadequacies. She had encountered them before, and she had learned long ago not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But as she looked at him now, she could sense something darker, something that went beyond the usual bravado. He wasn't just irritated by her presence, he felt threatened by it. Her mere existence, her calm defiance, seemed to unsettle something in him, something raw and unresolved. The silence between them grew thick, tense, charged with an unspoken challenge. Tasha could feel the weight of his gaze, the barely concealed hostility that simmered beneath his exterior. She didn't need to provoke him, she knew her presence alone was enough to stoke whatever frustrations and insecurities lay buried within him. For a moment she considered walking away, ending the encounter before it escalated. But something held her back, an instinct, a sense that this was a battle she needed to face. As the tension hung between them, both of them unmoving, Tasha felt a calm determination settle over her. She was ready for whatever was coming next, prepared to meet it head-on. This wouldn't be the first time she'd stood her ground in the face of unwarranted authority. But something told her that tonight would be different. Stevens felt his pulse quicken as he continued to scrutinize Tasha. He was used to people shrinking under his gaze, averting their eyes, stammering excuses, eager to escape his line of questioning. But this woman was different. She stood there, calm and unyielding, her gaze steady as though she were dissecting him, not the other way around. It was unsettling, infuriating even. He clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar prickling sensation of his authority being questioned, an itch he was determined to scratch. "So, you're here." Training, he enunciated each word slowly, like he was rolling them around in his mouth, trying to find any weakness, any inconsistency he could latch onto. Strange place and time for a workout, don't you think? I don't usually find people wandering around abandoned buildings at night, especially not people like you. His tone carried an edge, a barely concealed insinuation that Tasha recognized all too well. Tasha didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him, as though she were analyzing a subject she found only vaguely interesting. The calmness in her gaze, the quiet confidence, was starting to unsettle Stevens in a way he couldn't quite place. He took a step closer, letting the faint beam of his flashlight illuminate her face, watching for any flicker of emotion. But there was none. She was as steady as a rock. "Yes," training Tasha replied, her voice smooth, unperturbed. "I like the isolation. It helps me focus." She let a small pause linger, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Some people might find it intimidating. But I don't." The implication wasn't lost on Stevens. His hand flexed unconsciously near his belt, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his baton. The urge to provoke her, to shake that eerie calmness, was growing stronger. He couldn't understand why, but something about her defiance, her lack of fear, was getting under his skin. He wanted her to react, to show something: fear, nervousness, anything that would confirm his authority, his control. Instead, she gave him nothing, a blank slate that only reflected his own frustrations back at him. "You don't seem to understand," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You're on private property. I could have you arrested for trespassing right now. Maybe you should be a bit more cooperative." He watched her face closely, waiting for her to blink, to falter, but her expression remained impassive. Tasha took a measured breath, keeping her composure intact. She'd dealt with men like Stevens before, men who saw authority as a means of projecting their insecurities onto others. She knew that any sign of intimidation would only embolden him, feeding into his twisted sense of superiority. So she chose her words carefully, a calm smile barely touching the corners of her mouth. "Officer, I'm not here to cause trouble. Just getting in a bit of training, and then I'll be on my way," she replied evenly, her voice unwavering. She made a point to emphasize the word officer, a subtle reminder of the line he was towing. No need to make this into something it isn't. Stevens' jaw tightened, a flash of anger breaking through his mask of control. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She was supposed to stammer apologies, maybe even ask for leniency. But instead, she was practically dismissing him, speaking to him as if he were the one wasting her time. He couldn't let this slide. He needed to reassert his dominance, remind her of the balance of power here. "Make this into something it isn't," he repeated mockingly, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You think I'm the one blowing things out of proportion?" He let out a humorless laugh, taking another step closer, now close enough that Tasha could smell the faint traces of stale coffee on his breath. "Listen here, lady. I'm the one asking the questions, not you. And I'm the one who decides what's necessary. There was a dangerous gleam in his eye, a flicker of something darker and more primal. Tasha felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins, every muscle in her body attuned to the subtle threat that was coiling around them. She knew men like Stevens could escalate at the drop of a hat, their aggression a thin veneer over their insecurity. But she also knew how to handle it. She had spent years navigating these kinds of confrontations, honing her instincts to a razor's edge. Calmly, she held her ground, her gaze unwavering. "If you're looking for trouble, officer, you won't find it here," she replied, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "I'm simply exercising my right to be here. There's no crime in that." Her words only seemed to infuriate him further. Stevens could feel his blood boiling, the veneer of professionalism slipping away, revealing the raw, unchecked aggression beneath. He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper, each word laced with menace. "Let me make one thing clear," he hissed, his face inches from hers now. "You don't get to tell me what's a crime and what's not. I'm the law here. And I suggest you remember that before you find yourself in a situation you'll regret." Tasha felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to break eye contact. Instead, she matched his intensity, letting her own steel-hard resolve shine through her gaze. "And let me make something clear to you, officer," she replied, her tone as steady as ever. "I've dealt with far worse than you. You don't intimidate me." The bluntness of her statement seemed to slice through him like a knife. For a moment, Stevens faltered, his bravado wavering. This was not the reaction he had expected, not the fear or submission he was accustomed to. There was a look in her eyes, a defiant strength that made him feel exposed, vulnerable even. It was as though she could see right through him, into the insecurities he tried so desperately to mask. His reaction was almost reflexive, a knee-jerk response to the challenge she had thrown at him. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, his grip tight and yielding. "I suggest you watch your tone," he spat, his voice barely more than a growl. "I don't take kindly to disrespect." Tasha's eyes flashed, a surge of adrenaline spiking as she felt his hand clamp down on her arm. She could feel the raw aggression in his grip, the desperation of a man who was teetering on the edge of control. She knew that any overt reaction could escalate the situation, but her instincts were already kicking in, every fiber of her being ready to defend herself if necessary. "Let go of me," she said calmly, her voice low and measured. There was no fear in her tone, only a quiet, deadly resolve that made the hairs on the back of Stephen's neck stand up. For a brief moment, he considered releasing her, something in her eyes warning him that he was treading on dangerous ground. But his pride wouldn't allow it. He tightened his grip, sneering down at her. Or what he taunted, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you're in any position to make demands? You're nothing but a trespasser here, just another nobody who thinks they're above the rules." Tasha felt a surge of anger, but she kept it in check, allowing a slight smile to tug at the corner of her mouth. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she murmured, her words barely audible but carrying a weight that sent a shiver down his spine. Stevens tried to shake off the unease that crept over him, doubling down on his aggressive stance. "Oh, I think I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he sneered. "Just another nobody who thinks she's special. But let me tell you something out here. It's my rules that matter, and you'd do well to remember that." Tasha's smile widened, a knowing glint in her eye. "That's where you're wrong," she replied, her voice steady, unyielding. "I don't operate by anyone's rules but my own, and I don't scare easily." For the first time, Stevens felt a flash of genuine uncertainty. The woman standing before him was not just another defiant civilian. There was something about her that felt different, something that made him question his usual approach. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. He was too far in, too committed to asserting his authority. He squared his shoulders, his grip on her arm unwavering. "Let's see how brave you are when you're behind bars," he threatened, his voice laced with barely controlled rage. Tasha's response was immediate, a cold, hard laugh that echoed through the empty warehouse, chilling in its defiance. "Is that all you've got?" she challenged, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "If you're going to make threats, officer, you'd better be ready to back them up." Her words hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down between them, an unspoken dare. And as Stevens looked into her eyes, he realized that he might have bitten off more than he could chew. Stevens' fingers dug into Tasha's arm as he tried to wrench her closer, his grip tightening with each second that she refused to back down. The faint hint of a smirk on her face only intensified his frustration, turning what might have been a routine confrontation into something far more personal. He was used to instilling fear, used to people quailing under his authority, yet here was this woman standing defiantly before him, daring him to go further. "You're really testing your luck tonight, lady," he spat, his voice low and laced with anger. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his face reddening as the adrenaline pumped through his veins. His grip grew firmer, and he leaned closer, letting the threat in his posture do the talking. Tasha looked down at his hand on her arm, then slowly raised her gaze back to meet his eyes, a calmness in her expression that only served to further unsettle him. She raised an eyebrow slightly, as if to say, "Is that all you've got?" Her composure was like a slap in the face, a silent reminder that his intimidation tactics weren't working. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, officer," she said, her voice steady and unshaken. "You're out of your depth." For a moment Stevens froze, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of her words. It was as if she were daring him to go further, daring him to do something he might regret. He released her arm abruptly, the sudden absence of his grip leaving a tangible tension hanging in the air between them. He took a step back, adjusting his stance as he tried to regain his composure, but the look in her eyes, that unwavering confidence, was gnawing at him, pushing him to the brink. "Out of my depth," he echoed with a mocking laugh, though it came out strained, forced. "Lady, do you even know who you're talking to? I'm the one who makes the rules around here. You're just another nobody wasting my time." Tasha's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her calm. "Funny, I thought enforcing the law was about protecting people, not harassing them," she replied coolly, letting the words sink in. Stephen's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt where his baton hung. He wanted to shake her, to tear that smug look off her face, but he forced himself to stay in control. His mind raced, searching for something, anything that would break her composure and put him back in command of the situation. "So, you're some kind of smartass?" "Ha," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you're clever? Think you're some kind of tough girl? Well, let me tell you something, I've seen your type before. Big talk, acting like you're untouchable. But when it comes down to it, you're just another face in the crowd, another nobody who thinks they can do whatever they want." Tasha took a small step back, creating a deliberate distance between them, her expression unchanged. "If you think I'm just another nobody, then why are you still here?" she asked calmly, folding her arms. Her voice was soft, almost too calm, yet each word hit him like a slap. "You're the one making this a scene, officer. All I wanted was to be left alone." Her words were like a mirror, reflecting his own insecurity, his own need to dominate. For a moment he saw himself through her eyes, an overzealous cop desperate to prove himself. It stung, and he hated her for it, hated her for showing him something he didn't want to see. Without thinking, he reached for his baton, pulling it free from his belt with a swift motion. "All right, enough games," he growled, holding the baton firmly in his hand. "I'm done playing nice." Tasha's eyes flickered to the baton, but her expression remained unreadable. Her gaze shifted back to his face, and she studied him with a look that was equal parts pity and patience, as if she were observing a child throwing a tantrum. "I don't think you understand what you're doing, officer," she said softly. "This won't end the way you think it will." The calmness in her voice, the certainty in her words, shook him. He was teetering on the edge, a thin line separating him from actions he might not be able to take back. But he had gone too far now. There was no backing down without losing face. He raised the baton slightly, using it as a subtle threat, hoping to see a glimmer of fear in her eyes. But there was nothing. Her gaze remained steady, watching him, assessing him, as if he were the one being evaluated, the one on trial. "You think you're untouchable," he hissed, taking another step forward. "You think I won't do it? All it takes is one call, and I'll have you cuffed and on the ground before you can say another word." Tasha's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile, and she shook her head slowly. "You think that would stop me? You think that would solve anything? Go ahead. Call for backup. Let's see how far you're willing to go." Her words hit him like a slap, the challenge clear in her tone. She was daring him to escalate, daring him to make a fool of himself. His hand tightened around the baton, and he felt a surge of anger, a need to prove himself, to show her who was really in charge. But beneath the anger was something else, something darker: fear. The fear that she might be right, that he was losing control, that he was in over his head. Without thinking, he swung the baton, aiming for her shoulder in a quick, aggressive motion meant to intimidate. But Tasha was faster. She sidestepped with practiced ease, her movements fluid and controlled, and his baton hit nothing but air. He stumbled slightly, caught off balance, and she watched him with a look that was almost bored. "You're not very good at this, are you?" she said, her tone a mix of disappointment and challenge. Stephen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, and he tightened his grip on the baton, raising it again. "You think this is a game?" he snarled, his voice louder, rougher, the thin veneer of professionalism cracking under the strain. "I'm giving you one last chance to comply. Also, help me. I'll make you regret it." Tasha sighed, glancing down at the baton as if it were a toy. "Regret it? Regret what, exactly?" she asked, her voice calm and unperturbed. "You're the one swinging a baton at an unarmed woman. If anyone's going to have regrets, it's not going to be me." For a split second, he hesitated, her words striking a nerve. He knew she was right, knew that if anyone saw this, his career would be on the line. But his pride, his need to assert control, overpowered his reason. He lunged forward, bringing the baton down in a wide arc, determined to land a blow, determined to make her back down. In a swift, seamless motion, Tasha caught his wrist mid-swing, stopping him cold. Her grip was like iron, her strength surprising, almost unnatural. She met his gaze with a steely intensity, her eyes hard and unyielding, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of real fear. "Let go of me," he growled, his voice shaking slightly, though he tried to mask it with anger. Tasha held his gaze, her grip unrelenting. "Make me," she whispered, her voice low, challenging. The words hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down between them, and he knew, in that moment, that he was outmatched. With a sudden burst of desperation, he yanked his arm free, stumbling backward. The baton slipped from his fingers, clattering to the ground with a hollow, metallic sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. He stared at her, breathing heavily, his mind racing, searching for something, anything that would give him back the upper hand. Tasha watched him with quiet, unblinking eyes, her expression unreadable. She didn't move to pick up the baton, didn't make any aggressive gestures. She simply stood there, calm and poised, as though she were in complete control of the situation. It was a silence that spoke louder than words, a silence that told him, in no uncertain terms, that she was not afraid. For a moment they stood in a tense standoff, the air thick with unspoken tension. Stephen's chest rose and fell with each heavy breath, his mind clouded by a mixture of anger and fear. He knew he had overstepped, knew he had lost control, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not to her. Finally, he forced himself to stand tall, squaring his shoulders, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain his composure. "You think you're clever," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "But I'm warning you, this isn't over." Tasha's gaze didn't waver. "No," she replied quietly, her voice steady, unwavering. "It's just beginning." Her words were a cold, hard truth, a reality that he could no longer ignore. And as he looked into her eyes, he realized with a sinking feeling that he was in deeper than he had ever intended. This was no ordinary confrontation, no routine power play. This was something far more dangerous, something that would leave a mark on both of them. The silence that followed Tasha's final words was thick, suffocating, hanging in the air like a storm cloud on the verge of bursting. The echo of her calm statement, "It's just beginning," rang in Stephen's ears, reverberating through his mind as he struggled to process what had just happened. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was losing control, that the situation had slipped far beyond the bounds of what he could handle with intimidation alone. For the first time in a long while, Stevens felt the icy grip of doubt wrapping around his spine. Tasha stood before him, unshaken, unyielding, as though she were carved from stone. Her calm defiance wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. It was the kind of confidence that came from experience, from knowing precisely what she was capable of. And deep down, Stevens knew she was more capable than he was willing to admit. His mind raced, scrambling for a way to regain control. But no matter how he turned the situation over in his head, he kept hitting a wall. Every tactic, every trick he usually used to assert dominance felt inadequate, hollow. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't a confrontation he could end with bluster and threats. The woman in front of him was not just challenging his authority, she was dismantling it piece by piece, and he could feel the foundation crumbling beneath him. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his pride, Stevens took a deep breath, steadying himself, and squared his shoulders. "You think you're special," he said, his voice low and venomous, each word laced with bitter resentment. "I could end this right now. One call, and I'd have backup here faster than you could blink. You wouldn't stand a chance." Tasha didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unyielding, as if his threats were nothing more than idle noise. "Then make the call," she replied, her voice calm, almost challenging. "Go ahead. But ask yourself this, officer, what will they think when they see you struggling to handle one unarmed woman?" The subtle jab struck deeper than any physical blow could. Stevens felt the words cut through him, slicing through the thin veneer of control he'd managed to maintain. Her calm, quiet defiance was like a mirror held up to his insecurities, reflecting back everything he tried so hard to hide: his inadequacies, his weaknesses, the knowledge that his authority was a fragile thing, built on fear and intimidation. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to suppress the rage bubbling up inside him. He couldn't let her win. Not here, not now. His pride, his very identity, was on the line, and he refused to let her walk away with the last word. Without another thought, he lunged forward, his hand reaching out to grab her again, desperate to assert some semblance of control. But Tasha was faster. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped his grasp, her body moving with a grace and precision that left him stumbling forward, off balance. Before he could recover, she twisted around, her arm moving in a blur as she caught his wrist, twisting it just enough to force him to his knees without causing serious harm. Stevens gasped, pain shooting up his arm as he felt his balance slip away. He was on his knees, his hand twisted behind his back, completely at her mercy. The humiliation burned hot and deep, a fire that threatened to consume him. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, calm and steady, devoid of the anger he felt raging within himself. It was as though she saw through him, stripping away the layers of arrogance and bluster to reveal the fear beneath. "Let me go," he hissed, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Tasha released his wrists slowly, taking a step back as he scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. For a moment they stood in silence, the air thick with tension, both of them acutely aware of the shift in power. Stevens could feel it slipping through his fingers, like sand slipping away no matter how tightly he tried to hold on. He took a shaky breath, his chest heaving as he struggled to regain his composure. But the damage was done. He could feel the doubt gnawing at him, the certainty that he was outmatched, that she was playing a game he didn't know the rules to. And the worst part was, he couldn't walk away. His pride wouldn't allow it. You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "You think you've won?" Tasha's gaze softened, almost pitying, as if she could see the inner turmoil boiling beneath his anger. "This was never about winning, officer," she replied quietly. "It's about standing up for myself. Something you clearly don't understand." Her words stung, cutting through him with a sharpness he hadn't expected. It was as though she were peeling back the layers, exposing the parts of himself he tried so hard to keep hidden. His insecurities, his need for control, his fear of being seen as weak. And the worst part was, he couldn't deny it. Her words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of everything he despised about himself. In a desperate attempt to salvage his pride, he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, you're a real hero, aren't you? Standing up to the big bad cop. You must feel so brave." Tasha's expression remained calm, unaffected by his taunts. "Bravery has nothing to do with it," she replied simply. "It's about doing what's right, regardless of the consequences." And Stevens felt his composure cracking, the thin veneer of control slipping away as he struggled to maintain his facade. Her calmness, her quiet strength, was like a mirror held up to his insecurities, reflecting back everything he tried so hard to hide. He could feel himself unraveling, his anger giving way to something darker, something he didn't want to acknowledge. For a moment, he considered walking away, ending the confrontation before it spiraled out of control. But his pride wouldn't allow it. He was too far in, too committed to backing down now. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to suppress the rage bubbling up inside him. "You think you're better than me," he spat, his voice a low growl. "You think you can just walk in here and make me look like a fool?" Tasha shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "This isn't about you, officer," she replied softly. It never was. The simplicity of her statement, the calm acceptance in her voice, struck him like a blow. She wasn't fighting him. She wasn't trying to win. She was simply standing her ground, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to let his anger and aggression define her. For the first time, Stevens felt a flicker of doubt, a seed of uncertainty that took root in the depths of his mind. He was losing control, not just of the situation, but of himself. His anger, his need for dominance, was spiraling out of his grasp, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. and Tasha could see it. She could see the cracks in his armor, the fear lurking beneath the surface, and she was no longer afraid. She stood before him, calm and steady, her gaze unwavering, her strength unyielding. She was a force of nature, a quiet storm that couldn't be silenced, and he was powerless to stop her. In a final, desperate attempt to reassert his authority, Stevens reached for his radio, his hand trembling as he fumbled for the button. "I'm calling this in," he muttered, his voice shaky, laced with desperation. "I'm done playing games." But even as he spoke, he knew it was a hollow threat. There was no one to call, no backup that could save him from the confrontation he had started. He was alone, exposed, his authority stripped away, leaving him vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. Tasha watched him, a faint hint of sadness in her eyes. "You're making this harder on yourself than it needs to be," she said gently. "Walk away, officer. Let this go." But Stevens couldn't. His pride, his need for control, wouldn't allow it. He clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as he fought to suppress the storm of emotions raging inside him. He had started this, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two forces locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down. And in that silence, Stevens felt something break within him, a crack that widened with each passing second, each breath filled with tension and unspoken truths. He was losing. Not just the confrontation, but something deeper, something he couldn't name. And as he looked into Tasha's eyes, he knew, with a sinking feeling, that he was powerless to stop it. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to his own failures, his own insecurities. And there was no escape. As the silence between them stretched, Tasha could feel the tension thickening, almost palpable in the stale air of the warehouse. The faint light from outside cast long, flickering shadows, which seemed to dance along the walls, amplifying the sense of unease. Stevens' face was a mask of barely contained fury, his breathing shallow and quick as he struggled to regain his footing not just physically, but mentally. He looked like a man backed into a corner, teetering on the edge of control, and Tasha could sense that whatever was left of his composure was beginning to fray. She watched him carefully, every instinct alert. Years of training had taught her to read people, to see beyond the masks they wore. And right now, the mask Stevens had spent years constructing, the tough, unbreakable facade of a law enforcement officer, was beginning to crack. Beneath the bravado and anger, she saw something raw, something vulnerable, something he was desperately trying to hide. She knew men like him. She had faced them before, men who hid their insecurities behind a badge, using authority as a weapon to shield themselves from their own fears. But Stevens was different. There was a desperation in his eyes that went beyond the usual power play, a frantic need to prove something to himself, perhaps more than to her, and that made him dangerous. She knew that when people felt they were losing control, they often resorted to extremes, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind, the growing panic as he realized he was in over his head. Stevens' gaze flickered to his fallen baton, lying a few feet away on the ground where Tasha had disarmed him. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, torn between pride and practicality. But then, his face hardened and he lunged toward it, his movements frantic, uncoordinated. He snatched it up, gripping it tightly as though it were a lifeline, his knuckles white as he turned to face her, his expression a twisted blend of anger and humiliation. "You think this is funny?" he spat, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You think you're some kind of hero, standing up to me? You think you're untouchable?" Tasha remained calm, her gaze steady as she watched him, unfazed by his outburst. "I'm not here to play games with you, officer," she replied evenly. "But if you keep pushing this, it's not going to end the way you want." Her words hit him like a slap, a cold reminder of his diminishing power. He clenched his jaw, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain the rage boiling inside him. Every word she spoke, every calm, measured response, felt like a challenge, a reminder that he was losing control. And he couldn't stand it. He was used to people cowering in his presence, bending to his authority without question. But she was different, and it terrified him. Stevens took a step forward, brandishing the baton in a tight grip, his eyes narrowed with hatred. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just stand there and defy me? I could end this right now." Tasha raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his threat. "Then do it," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "If that's what you think you need to do, then go ahead. But just remember, every action has consequences." Her words struck a nerve, and he felt a flash of doubt, a seed of uncertainty that he tried to squash beneath his anger. But it was too late. Her calm, unwavering gaze was like a mirror, reflecting back everything he was trying to avoid: the fear, the insecurity, the realization that he was in over his head. And it was tearing him apart. In a desperate attempt to assert his authority, he took another step forward, swinging the baton in a wide arc, aiming for her shoulder. But Tasha was faster. She sidestepped his attack with ease, her movements fluid, almost effortless, and he stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the force of his own momentum. He caught himself just before he fell, his face red with embarrassment, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She had barely moved, barely broken a sweat, while he was losing control, spiraling further into a state of rage and desperation. He could feel the power dynamic shifting, slipping away from him, and it terrified him. "Why won't you just give in?" he snarled, his voice breaking as he glared at her, his hands trembling as he gripped the baton. "Why do you have to make this so hard?" Tasha looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment, her expression softening. "Because I don't let bullies intimidate me," she replied simply. "And I don't let people like you tell me who I am." Her words sliced through him, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the thin veneer of control he had left. He felt his composure slipping, his grip on reality beginning to fracture as the weight of her defiance bore down on him. She wasn't just challenging his authority, she was dismantling it, stripping away the illusions he had built around himself, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. In a moment of blind rage, he swung the baton again, this time aiming for her legs, desperate to knock her down, to see her crumble. But once again she was faster. She sidestepped his attack, her movements graceful, almost effortless, and he stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the force of his own swing. This time he couldn't catch himself. He fell to his knees, the baton slipping from his grasp as he hit the ground, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked up at her, his face twisted with anger and humiliation, his pride shattered as he knelt before her, defeated. For a long moment they stayed like that, locked in a tense silence, each of them acutely aware of the power shift that had just taken place. Stevens could feel the weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him, the realization that he was outmatched, that he had lost. Tasha took a step back, her gaze softening as she looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "It doesn't have to be this way," she said quietly, her voice gentle, almost compassionate. "You don't have to keep fighting me. You can choose to walk away." Her words were like a lifeline, a small, glimmering hope in the midst of his spiraling despair. But his pride, his need for control, wouldn't let him take it. He couldn't bear the thought of walking away, of admitting defeat, of letting her see him as anything less than the powerful figure he had built himself up to be. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to suppress the rage boiling inside him. "I don't need your pity," he spat, his voice trembling with anger and humiliation. "You think you're better than me? You think you're untouchable?" Tasha sighed, shaking her head slowly. "This isn't about being better, officer. It's about knowing who I am and refusing to let you take that from me." Her calm, measured words were like a mirror, reflecting back everything he hated about himself: the insecurity, the fear, the realization that he was nothing more than a man hiding behind a badge, using authority to mask his own inadequacies. And he couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand the thought of her seeing through him, of her knowing the truth. In a final, desperate act, he lunged forward, reaching for the baton that lay between them, his hand trembling as he gripped it tightly. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with rage and desperation, and swung the baton with all his strength, aiming for her head. But Tasha was ready. In one swift, fluid motion, she caught his wrist, twisting it just enough to force him to drop the baton, and stepped back, letting it fall to the ground. She looked at him, her gaze steady, unwavering, as he knelt before her, his chest heaving with the weight of his own defeat. "You don't have to keep fighting," she said quietly, her voice filled with a calm, gentle strength. "This isn't who you are. You're more than this." Her words struck him like a blow, the simplicity of her statement cutting through the anger, the desperation, the need for control. For a moment he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability, the raw, unfiltered truth of who he was beneath the uniform, the badge, the authority. The tension was palpable, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. Tasha stood her ground, watching Officer Stevens as he struggled to pull himself together, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and humiliation. She could see it clearly now: the desperation, the raw vulnerability he was trying so hard to bury beneath his rage. It was the look of a man realizing he had lost control, a man who had reached the edge of his own power. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, the warehouse around them echoing with a heavy, almost oppressive quiet. The baton lay between them on the ground, abandoned, a symbol of the authority Stevens had tried to wield and failed. Tasha's gaze didn't waver as she held his, her eyes steady and unyielding, her expression one of calm resolve. "You're done here," she said, her voice soft but firm, each word striking like a hammer against his fractured pride. "Walk away, officer. This doesn't have to get any worse for you." Her words were like a final blow, a reminder that she was still in control, that he had lost. He could feel the weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him, the bitter taste of defeat settling in his mouth. Every part of him wanted to lash out, to strike back, to reclaim the power he felt slipping through his fingers. But deep down, he knew that any further escalation would only dig him deeper into the hole he had made for himself. And yet his pride, his need to assert dominance, wouldn't let him accept defeat. With a low growl, he straightened up, his hands trembling as he glared at her, a fire of determination igniting in his eyes. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're untouchable?" Tasha raised an eyebrow, unperturbed by his words. "No," she replied calmly. "But I know where my limits are, and I'm not the one who's crossing them right now." The truth of her words hung between them, a cold, undeniable reality that cut through his anger like a knife. He was the one who had pushed this too far, the one who had allowed his own insecurities to turn a simple confrontation into something ugly, something he was beginning to realize he couldn't control. But his pride, his stubborn refusal to back down, blinded him to reason. In a final, desperate act, he lunged forward, his hand reaching for her arm in an attempt to reassert his dominance, to remind her of who held the power. But Tasha was ready. In one swift, fluid motion, she sidestepped his grasp, her hand shooting out to block his advance, her movements graceful and controlled. She didn't strike him, didn't use her strength to overpower him. Instead, she held him at bay with a firm, unyielding pressure, her presence a wall he couldn't break through. It was a display of restraint, a reminder that she was in control not because of her physical power, but because of her unwavering resolve. Stevens froze, caught off guard by her calm, steady response. He could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on him, a quiet strength that seemed to suffocate him, stripping away his defenses, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice gentle, almost compassionate. "Walk away. Let it go." Her words struck him like a blow, cutting through his anger, his desperation, leaving him raw and unguarded. For a moment he wavered, the weight of her gaze bearing down on him, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions, the consequences of his pride. But he couldn't accept it. He couldn't admit defeat, not to her, not to anyone. With a snarl, he jerked his arm free, stumbling back as he glared at her, his chest heaving with the force of his own frustration. He was breathing heavily, his body tense, coiled, as though preparing for another assault. But Tasha saw the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that betrayed him. "You're not going to win this, officer," she said, her voice soft but firm, each word a quiet declaration of truth. "The only way this ends is if you choose to walk away." Her words lingered in the air, a lifeline he couldn't bring himself to take. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to suppress the rage boiling inside him. Every instinct screamed at him to strike back, to reclaim the power he had lost. But he knew, deep down, that any further escalation would only deepen his humiliation, would only expose him further. In a final act of defiance, he spat on the ground between them, his face twisted with anger and frustration. "You're not worth my time," he snarled, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "But don't think this is over. People like you always end up paying for your arrogance." Tasha's expression didn't change, her gaze steady as she watched him, unflinching. "I'll take my chances," she replied simply, her voice calm, unshaken. "Now go. Before you make this any worse for yourself." For a moment he hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his defeat. But he knew, in his heart, that she was right. He had lost, and any further attempt to reassert his authority would only deepen his shame. With a final, furious glare, he turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing through the warehouse as he stormed away, his anger a burning ember he couldn't extinguish. Tasha watched him go, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady as she took a deep breath, letting the tension slowly drain from her body. She had won, but the victory felt hollow, a reminder of the ugliness that could arise from unchecked pride and desperation. As she stood alone in the empty warehouse, the silence settling around her, she felt a sense of calm wash over her, a quiet strength that filled the space where fear had once been. She had stood her ground, had faced down a man who had tried to use his power to intimidate her, and she had emerged unbroken. And in that moment she knew that no matter what came next, she would be ready. As the echo of Officer Stevens' footsteps faded into the distance, Tasha remained rooted in place, letting the weight of the silence settle around her. The confrontation had drained her, yet she felt a deep sense of calm, the kind that only comes from facing fear and standing firm. The dust and cold air of the warehouse felt oddly comforting now, a quiet sanctuary that witnessed her resolve against a force determined to break it. The events of the last hour replayed in her mind in fragments: the anger, the quiet moments of control, the brief flashes of vulnerability she had glimpsed in Stephen's eyes. She had seen him unravel, had watched as the facade he wore so tightly cracked under the strain of his own insecurities. But what struck her most was not the anger he directed at her. but the struggle she'd seen behind it, a conflict he likely had with himself far more often than with others. After a moment, Tasha finally allowed herself to exhale, a long, steady breath that released the residual tension from her muscles. She straightened up, shaking off the adrenaline that still lingered, a silent testament to her resilience. For years, she had faced intimidation, had dealt with men like Stevens who wielded authority as a weapon. But each time, she had emerged stronger, her sense of self unbroken. Glancing around the empty warehouse, she realized that this place had become a symbolic battleground, not just for herself, but perhaps for something greater. The warehouse, cold, abandoned, a place where the world had forgotten to look, had become the setting for her confrontation with not just Stevens, but everything he represented. She knew that there would be more encounters like this, more battles where she would have to stand firm. But the difference now was that she knew she could. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the baton Stevens had dropped during the confrontation. It lay on the floor, a discarded emblem of the power he had tried to exert over her. Tasha picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand, a reminder of the lengths he had gone to in his desperate attempt to control her. She considered taking it with her, a small token to remember this night, but decided against it. She wasn't here to carry the weight of his actions that was his burden to bear. Instead, she placed the baton gently back on the ground, a final act of release, as if laying to rest the power he had failed to use against her. With one last look at the dim, empty space around her, she turned and made her way toward the exit, her footsteps steady and resolute. Outside, the cool night air filled her lungs, refreshing and clear, washing away the stale scent of the warehouse. The world was quiet, still, a stark contrast to the tension she had just left behind. She paused for a moment, looking up at the stars, allowing herself a moment of peace. She was grateful for the calm, for the quiet assurance that she was in control of her life, her choices, her dignity. In the days that followed, Tasha carried on with her routine, her life resuming its steady rhythm. But she couldn't shake the memory of that night, of the way Stevens had looked at her, the way his authority had crumbled under the weight of his own insecurity. She wondered, briefly, if he would remember it too, if the encounter would linger in his mind as a reminder of his own limits. She hoped, for his sake, that he would learn from it, that he would find a way to confront whatever it was inside him that made him lash out. But if he didn't, she knew she would be ready to face him or anyone like him again. In quiet moments, she thought of others who might have faced Stephen's aggression without the tools or confidence to stand up for themselves. This thought stirred something within her, a desire to do more, to help others find their own resilience, their own strength. The confrontation had awakened a sense of responsibility, a need to ensure that others wouldn't be left defenseless, that they would have the chance to stand tall against intimidation, just as she had. And so she began to make plans, small steps towards something greater. She started speaking with community groups, sharing her experience, teaching others the skills and mindset they would need to face their own challenges. Little by little, she used the strength she had found within herself to empower others, to create a ripple effect that would extend beyond that one night, beyond her own life. For Officer Stevens, the night of the confrontation lingered like a shadow. In the days that followed, he couldn't escape the memory of her steady gaze, her calm voice, the way she had held her ground without fear. It haunted him, gnawing at his pride, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long tried to bury. He was left with a choice: continue down the path he had chosen, letting anger and insecurity drive him, or begin the difficult journey of confronting his own fears, his own weaknesses. And while he didn't know which path he would take, he knew one thing for certain: he would never forget the woman who had forced him to look into the mirror and see himself clearly, perhaps for the first time. As Tasha moved forward, She did so with a quiet confidence, a renewed sense of purpose. The night in the warehouse had been a test, one that had shown her not only her own strength, but the power of resilience, of standing firm in the face of adversity. It was a reminder that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the inner strength to overcome them. And as she walked forward, leaving the warehouse and the confrontation behind her, she knew that she would carry that strength with her, a quiet, unwavering force that no one could take away.